Welcome to the Re-Quilibrium podcast. I'm Danielle LaCourte, and this is a conversation with Dr. Matthew Lee, who is the Director of Empirical Research at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard University. Matt's research explores pathways to human flourishing, benevolent service to others, and the integration of social science and the humanities. And in this conversation, we wrestle with the question, what does it really mean to be well? We discuss facets of human flourishing like love, spirituality, and inner peace, and we do so from an empirical perspective. You'll also get quite a few book recommendations from this conversation, as well as an app to help track your own flourishing. So pop over to this episode's page on daniellelacourte.com/podcast for those resources. I also just wanted to mention briefly that this conversation is audio only, but it will still be available on YouTube if that's your preferred platform for this content. You can subscribe to Re-Quilibrium there or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also sign up for Re-Quilibrium's email list at daniellelacourte.com/podcast for some exclusive content and to be notified of new episodes. And if you've liked the content so far, rate me on Apple Podcasts, follow me on Medium, Instagram, or LinkedIn at Danielle LaCourte, or consider supporting me on Patreon at Danielle LaCourte, LeCourt. So now let's get right into my conversation with Matt Lee. So Matt, thank you so much for joining the podcast. And you're going to have to forgive me, but I'm gonna throw you into the deep end to start here. And
Sure.
I'm just going to ask you a simple and pretty complicated question, which is, what does it mean to be well?
Well, I think that if we want to understand flourishing as complete well being, which is how we view it at the Human Flourishing Program, then we want to understand what's going well for the individual, what's going well for their community, and what's going well for the larger ecosystem that sustains them. And so it's important for us to know about the individual's subjective experience. We want to know how they are actually living and experiencing life. And so we want to know how they think about the various domains of well being. And this could be happiness and life satisfaction, which is what we often think of, but meaning and purpose, character and virtue, the quality of their social relationships. There's other domains. And we want to understand that from their perspective, the individual's perspective. We can also look at more objective indicators. If somebody says that they're doing very well emotionally, but they've been clinically diagnosed with some problem, then we would want to bring both of those bits of information into dialogue. So, objective indicators, subjective indicators at the individual level. At the community level, for an individual to flourish, it's good to be in a flourishing community. And this means a community where there's a sense of belongingness, a sense of um, trust in other members in the community and in the leaders in the community, a sense of mission and purpose within the community. And so it's really helpful for individuals to be embedded in a context that is well. And we would want to understand that subjectively and objectively again. And then, of course, the broader environment is very important. Those are the things that most people can agree on. We also have a measure of spiritual well being because for many people, a clear majority, but perhaps not everyone, the experience of spirituality is really important to their overall well being. And for some people, it's the most important domain. So in our research, we start with this kind of baseline model that almost everybody agrees on. And then, if it's appropriate, we can ask questions about spirituality as well.
I love that you brought that up and that you include the domain of spirituality in this idea of wellness, because at least in the content that I'm seeing, about health and wellness, there seem to be these pockets of the human experience that are maybe underemphasized at best and sometimes just completely ignored. And spirituality seems to be one of those. Another one I think is love and
Mm.
the presence of love and the experience of love in one's life. Can you speak to that? Of why do you think that is? Why do you think that there tend to be these holes in the conversation when we're talking about wellness and a rich, flourishing human life?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that we have this book that just came out with Oxford University Press, and it's the title is "Measuring Well-Being: Interdisciplinary Perspectives from the Social Sciences and the Humanities." And it's an edited book, and listeners can download it for free at Oxford. It's an open access volume, and we felt that it was important to bring this conversation into an interdisciplinary space because oftentimes social scientists, and I'm a sociologist by background, um, tend to focus on what theologians call penultimate concerns rather than ultimate concerns. And the ultimate concerns engage with questions of spirituality, but a lot of times social science is directed at a more narrow purpose. And of course, the many of the luminaries in social science, like Maslow, for example, was they were not limited in this way. And for Maslow, the aim of human life was not some kind of hedonistic happiness, but as he put it, to become a sound member of the human species. And he talked in terms of self transcendence and a calling greater than one's kind of narrow self interest. For many religious people, the ideal of neighbor love, and you brought up love, and I was glad that you did. The ideal of neighbor love is really important to what it means to be well. And for those who believe in God, the idea of loving God and being loved by God is really important. So we wrote a book a few years ago now called The Heart of Religion, which was about experiencing divine love and expressing divine love in a Christian context, mostly in the US, in a way that enlivens and expands benevolent service to others. And this is what it means to live well and to have complete well-being, is to be plugged into that experience of a transcendent love that calls you to a cause outside of yourself. So you can be happy in a narrow sense in focusing on more materialistic or hedonistic considerations, but you can't fully flourish without becoming, again, what Maslow said is a sound member of the human species, and this means going beyond just your own selfish material and hedonistic pleasure. And this aligns, as I was saying, with the great wisdom traditions of the world, which almost without exception, are wonderful windows into the experience of love, which for me is very central to what it means to flourish.
Yeah, well, and I'm wondering if there's a reason why, historically speaking, it seems like these concepts of love and service, and maybe this isn't true, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like these concepts have kind of been housed within religious domains and not necessarily within other disciplines of thought and intellectual disciplines. I mean, and I'm wondering, I guess I'm wondering if there's a particular framework that kind of drives the way our society has been created so far, of,
Mm,
and I would speak to that of like, kind of like a pathological mindset that there's so many disciplines that were developed to solve a problem. And the main metaphor underneath that being there's a problem to be solved. And it seems like what the Human Flourishing Project, and I know Harvard Shine is another one, but it's almost this kind of flipping the paradigm a little bit to, rather than kind of finding pathologies and figuring out how to solve them, take a more integrated approach that brings in domains that haven't necessarily intermixed in the past. Is my understanding correct, or do you see it a different way?
Yeah, I think there's been some compartmentalization, and this is why in our book we felt that it was important to bring in the humanities because I think there's more comfort there, talking about spiritual love, for example, within philosophy or theology or some of these disciplines. And so, we want to be informed as social scientists by the rich wisdom traditions of the humanities, and I do think that a lot of social science research has been rather narrow in its orientation. And for example, in our book, I co-authored a chapter on inner peace, and my co-author and I say that this has not figured prominently in the well-being or flourishing literature. And maybe we're looking for more balance or wholeness in our lives because we know that there's suffering and we know that there's a lot of conflict and trauma in the world. And there's a wonderful book. The title is Mathematics for Human Flourishing, and it frames flourishing as wholeness amidst difficulty, among other things. I mean, it's richer than that, but it's this idea of being well, recognizing that you're not escaping from the fact that, for example, math is difficult. And I don't know how much wholeness or peace or related constructs have factored into a lot of the research to date. That's been more analytical rather than holistic. And I think and you mentioned Shine, I think they're very much about linking together the well-being of individuals with the well-being of work culture, creating a caring climate, for example, within the organization, in a way that's environmentally sustainable and healthy. Creates a net positive benefit to the world, and that's a more holistic way of thinking. I think that's really catching on quite a bit. But there is a tendency, I think, within social science disciplines historically to be very specialized, rather compartmentalized, and oftentimes focused on one or two domains of well-being, but not seeing the big picture. And depending on the discipline, maybe a little bit too individualistic.
Well, and I even as you're talking, thinking about some of the other clients that I work with a lot of data scientists, for example, and I also work with people in pharmaceuticals and the medical field. And you even look at fields like that, and there tends to be this pursuit of problem solving and this kind of, I won't say a myopic focus, but um, a need to arise to solve a problem, and rather than kind of viewing this holism as you mentioned. And I love this idea of that holistic metaphor to underlie how we move forward, because I think we're at this point in time, and this is something that I spoke with Eileen McNeely about on the podcast earlier, was how do we rectify, how do we actually build these things like love and caring into our systems, because our systems are in a way, just an extension of ourselves. And so I don't know if you can
Yeah.
speak to that a little bit, of how do we start to, those people who are in positions where they are building companies, they're building teams, they're building apps, they're, analyzing data systems. How do we start to incorporate these things like caring and love and spirituality into how we build things for society?
It's a wonderful question. I could probably fill the rest of the hour on it. Um, part of it, um, I think, goes back to what do we mean by love, and this is a very challenging topic in organizations because there's a lot of cultural confusion about love. And I'm involved in a project now. There's a group that offers a journal called the Humanistic Management Journal, and they serve this broader movement within leadership to promote flourishing. And love is really about promoting flourishing. So a leader can ask the question, am I creating an extractive process or contributing to an extractive process that leaves employees diminished, that leaves the environment diminished, that ultimately isn't good for the people using our product or service, or am I part of a process that is more regenerative? And that's going to produce sustainable flourishing, and that's actually an act of love. So a number of us have just written an article for this journal where we're trying to bring the grammar of business into dialogue with the grammar of love. Because these are different languages, and they can actually be brought into a very constructive dialogue, but we have to set aside some of the confusion about what love is. And this is where I think, the um, well, Eileen, and our program director Tyler, and another member of the School of Public Health, Howard Coe, wrote this article for the Journal of the American Medical Association, where they said it's time to reimagine health as flourishing, because we don't want to just um, treat someone's depression and get them back to languishing. What kind of goal is that? Or, when we're making end of life decisions, we don't want to just preserve the body at all costs and not consider the growth and sort of emotional well-being and ability to be in relationship of the person. And so we want people to really engage with all of the domains of flourishing as they reflect on the important decisions of their lives. And that includes in the workplace and even for business organizations. Is my work contributing to a world in which flourishing um, is more attainable for more people, and in ways that don't harm the larger environment? And if the answer is yes, then that's love. And why not, call it that and draw upon some of the great resources from the humanities to make sense of our lives, to make our lives more meaningful, and know that that's what we're doing, and then be very clear on our language so that when we use the word love, it's not confused. One great example is the former CEO of Southwest Airlines. When he signed an email to employees, "Love Herb," they knew what he meant and they knew what he didn't mean. And when he passed away, like 5,000 employees turned out for his funeral because he put that into practice. On Thanksgiving holiday, he's with the baggage handlers loading planes or something. You've got to work on the holiday, I'm going to work with you. There's not going to be this rigid distinction between people who have to do the unpleasant tasks and people who are sheltered from that. We're going to share in this work. And so, in some, there's a limit, I guess, to what the word love can mean in an employee sort of boss relationship. But you can make a gesture in that direction.
I'm really glad you brought up the getting back to languishing thing too, because I know that has been it's been in the press lately. And that was researchers at the Human Flourishing Program that were cited in the New York Times article that just recently came out, right?
Yes, our director Tyler Vanderweel was cited in that
Yeah, can
article.
you
Yes.
expand on that concept for anyone who doesn't exactly know what that means when you talk about languishing? What does that mean and why does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we would want, I think all people would want to be really enthusiastic about their lives and feel that they're leading a very vibrant, meaningful life. So just, the absence of a physical health problem or a financial worry or a mental health issue. I'm not depressed, I'm not anxious, but I just feel like I'm going nowhere. That's languishing. And in fact, life is very abundant if we notice it. And there are certain practices that we can engage in to help notice this. And so on our website, if you go to the Human Flourishing program at Harvard and look for our web app, it's a free app that allows you to both self-assess your own flourishing and um, other things like comprehensive measure of meaning, but also um, engage in some activities and get some guidance on how to do these activities that can help you notice the abundance that's all around you. And so, doing some savoring practices or gratitude practices, even just engaging in some simple acts of kindness. And so, that's what the New York Times article was partly about. If you feel like you're languishing, what can you do as an individual? I mean, certainly there's a lot of work that we can do collectively, but right now, today, at no cost to me, what can I do? Well, I can do some of these, the savoring activity and get some guidance on how to do that and start to live into the abundance that's always present. And I think that's also a more spiritual way to engage with life is to really notice um, the potential and the possibility in every interaction so that you don't feel like you're just going nowhere.
Yeah, and I think that that speaks also to, I like that you're providing these tools, and something that it's just a personal pet peeve of mine, this how things of with the media cycles and with content being so quick now, people are like always interested in quick hacks to your behavior. How do you
Yeah,
hack? And it's like,
yeah,
well, but you're still doing all of this within a holistic system. And so,
right.
but I do get the need to have some tools to design your life for flourishing, and there are things you can do on an individual level that aren't hacks, but it's basically approaching things in the spirit of having all the aspects of
Mhm,
your life support all the other aspects of your life, support your community, support your family, and kind of radiate out from there. I don't know
mhm,
how you see these individual practices kind of merging with the systemic context and we live in all the in our
mhm.
communities. How do all these things work together?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I guess I'll answer it two ways. First, I can say, some of our research at the Human Flourishing Program has shown a lot of benefit to being involved in a religious community. So, attending services, praying or meditating frequently. These are these are associated at the individual level with higher levels of happiness, lower depression, and a greater likelihood of volunteering. And volunteering, some of our other research shows, is really helpful for overcoming loneliness, which is a big deal. Loneliness is in some ways just as harmful as smoking cigarettes or something. So there's benefits to the community when you volunteer, but there's also benefits to yourself in terms of your own health and well-being. And people don't initially pursue volunteering for its benefits to themselves. They don't go to religious services because they're trying to stave off a heart condition or something. These are side effects of getting involved in these collective kinds of settings. Um, and so if you volunteer, you have a higher sense of purpose, and you're also more physically active, and all of those kinds of things help you stay healthier, live longer, and be able to do more with your life. And then you can start to get plugged into the unlimited opportunities to bring some healing and wholeness to a suffering world. And it's only when you connect with other people who are doing this at scale that you can make a big difference. It's important to act locally, but it's also important to think about how are we becoming a better steward of the broader system. That could be the global system. And what are our responsibilities in light of, as I was alluding to earlier, the kind of extractive, degrading processes that are happening throughout the world, and how can we work with others to bring more of a regenerative approach to anything that we might be involved in, industrial kinds of activities, or even education. Education can be quite extractive and diminishing of human beings, or it can be a wonderful place of great love and flourishing.
And when you say extractive, what exactly do you mean by that? What is your measure for when something is extractive, and how do you see it showing up in different facets of society?
Well, I think that if you're farming, for example, and the soil is alive when you start, and by the time you're done, you've turned it into lifeless dirt. That's the easy example. Um, but I think that I'll go back to education since I teach classes, and I've experienced as a student and as a teacher classes that people left diminished, like there was something that went wrong there, and there might have been some energy at the beginning, and by the end people are just worn out, and you think, you know how do you learn if you're being diminished? And so I started and we deal with difficult topics. I teach a class at Harvard called Conflict, Justice, and Healing. And it used to be I taught classes on conflict and justice, and there was no healing. And I thought this isn't right. We're demoralizing students in trying to convey to them just how intractable some of these problems are. But that's not really what education is all about. And so we started to build in some contemplative practices into class meetings, and also, keeping a contemplative journal outside of class, and just trying to help students, and frankly me, connect with, what is life affirming here in this work. How can we move this forward in ways that don't diminish ourselves, because so many activists um, become physically ill, fighting for justice, or whatever. And is there a way to do this that brings a greater sense of healing and wholeness to the individuals involved, and to the communities, and even the life sustaining systems of the planet?
I'm so curious now, because it's interesting because my next interview guest is going to be Dr. Danya Ramore. She's a MIT grad. She teaches at the University of Utah. She does a lot of environmental dispute resolution, and so she and I are going to be speaking about conflict in detail. But I'm really glad you brought it up because now I'm seeing this idea of regeneration in the context of conflict. Do you find
Mm,
how
mm,
is it possible for conflict itself? And maybe this is really timely because we are living in a pretty highly
mm,
conflicting time
mhm.
during the pandemic, during everything that's going on in the United States and the world. Um, do you think conflict can be regenerative? And if so, how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. My own perspective, and I've learned this from many others who work in this field, is that we have to start with the understanding that conflict is normal. We want to push it away. But actually, conflict is telling us something. It's revealing a truth that otherwise was below the surface. And so there was maybe some simmering resentment or something that we weren't aware of. And now it's out in the open. And so we don't want the harmful outcomes associated with unskillful conflict transformation, or ignoring the conflict. But we want to learn the important truth that this conflict is revealing, and then ask the question, what is the potential here for greater flourishing, for greater wholeness? What is necessary for us to move past the continual creation of episodes of conflict and get to the epicenters, get to the deeper roots, so that we can begin to actually transform the circumstance. So I did some work with restorative justice for many years, and we would um, prepare victims and offenders to crime victims and offenders to meet, and sort through issues together, and find a way to, as Howard Zare very aptly put it, to make things as right as possible. You can't turn back the clock. You can't undo the damage that's been done, but you can help victims release some of the fear or sense of being trapped or whatever. So there are things that you can do, and but that doesn't go far enough because we're still generating incidents of crime that are harming people. And so there's some community lessons that can be learned about restorative justice work. So you've got a particular conflict between a victim and offender that you're bringing some healing and some wholeness to that. But if the roots of those kinds of events are still present in the community, you really haven't transformed anything. So, in order for that work to be truly regenerative, the community has to begin to address these roots, and they're deep roots, and they go all the way down to our mental models of what a human being is. Are some human beings more fully human than others? Some human beings more fully deserving of a flourishing life than others? And when we start to explore those kinds of questions, we can see how these mental models generate the structures that then allow the sort of conditions to be present so that crime and other conflicts erupt rather predictably. So, how do we begin to work at that deep level? I think that's a really beautiful and life affirming path for anyone to follow and to try to make a contribution there. But we have to recognize that just doing something at the surface, like a victim offender mediation, is insufficient for dealing with that deeper work.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up mental models as well. And there was a question I was going to ask you earlier when you were speaking about, kind of getting on the same page in terms of language. And this is something that I bring up a lot because it's something that I'm very passionate about is why language matters and how they feed into these mental models and how these underlying metaphors really shape our worldview and therefore shape our behaviors. I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit of why does language matter? How do they play into mental models and how does this all work?
Well, yes, this could be, I don't know, 6 week seminar or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I'll just introduce one idea. Um, you had referred to kind of this problem solving approach earlier, and when we adopt a problem solving model, we're focused on something negative, and immediately the reward center in the brain is sort of turned off, and the pain center is turned on, and we're not as motivated. It's hard to get excited about that. So there's this process called appreciative inquiry, which I think allows us, as the developer of this talks about it, it's a process for liberating power because it is energizing and inspiring, and it allows us to live into the vision we have of a good world and our best possible self. And we start with that, and so the reward center in the brain is lighting up while we're doing this work. And I think the danger is, I think there's this group, Well-Being in the Nation Network, and they've I think very effectively talked about system stewardship. And when you start thinking about big systems, you can feel like, what can I do? I'm just one individual. This is overwhelming work. And then once again, the pain center lights up and you lose motivation. And so they've very helpfully identified that if we are stuck in an adversity economy, we're just running from one crisis to another and nothing much is changing, that is not energizing, and in the long run that's going to be ineffective. So we need to move out of patterns that reproduce trauma and exclusion, even if they're trying to respond to an urgent crisis, and move into a different way of organizing our society rooted in dignity and inclusion, but one that fosters the vital conditions so that everyone can flourish. And this is the notion of healthier soil, greater flourishing. If you've got very barren soil, resilient plants can struggle to survive, but you don't have the abundance. So you want to foster, belonging and civic muscle and a thriving natural world, and, opportunities for very regenerative lifelong learning. and you start to create these vital conditions, and you shift out of that adversity economy and into a well-being economy. But if you're reacting to problems all the time, that's actually reinforcing some fundamental patterns of trauma and exclusion that go back to those mental models. You can't really understand how is this connected to my understanding of what a person is. If a person has um, sort of inherent dignity, unlimited value, then we have to design our systems differently. We can't leave people in extractive settings. And so I think that notion of moving out of an economy based on adversity to an economy based on well-being. And you can look at the healthcare system. We talked about the justice system, but the healthcare system that wants to keep people on maintenance meds, um, when we really need to think about stress and how we relate to stress and how stress is structured into our environment. And a lot of why people are on maintenance meds is stress related, and so we can start to this is the blue zones idea. Some people have probably read the book on the blue zones, but there are some environments where the soil is just very healthy, and you don't need all of this expensive, maintenance meds, and you have, longer lives and more healthy years, more flourishing years, as Tyler has written about. That's really, I think, what we should be focused on. How do we get excited about creating blue zones? Not how do we respond to somebody with treating their symptoms. Let's get to the roots, and that, I think, is inspiring work if you start with the idea. And again, I think this is a spiritual idea that every human being has unlimited value, and that how could we allow people to languish? How could we allow people to continue to struggle in environments that are primarily extractive?
I'm and I To your point about this adversity mindset too, and I know I'm not alone in experiencing this, especially in 2020. But I'm a human being with lots of facets of my life. I have children. I have a job, and there's a tendency to pit all of these aspects of our lives against each other, and they're always in competition for
Mhm.
your attention and competition for your energy. And it seems like it seems really hard to break out of, frankly, in how if I'm spending time recording a podcast, I'm not spending time with my
Yeah.
children. If I'm spending time with my children, I'm doing worse at
Right.
my job. But is there another way to view this in which those things are all
Hmm.
supporting each other as
Hmm.
opposed to
Hmm.
being in competition with each
Yeah.
other? And how do we start to
Yeah.
think about that?
Another, this would be a 6-year course rather than 6 weeks. I will recommend a book by Jim Ritchie Dunham called Ecosonomics. It's the science of abundance, and he talks, I think, quite rightly about co-hosting at multiple levels. So you want to co-host with your deepest sense of self, like your authentic self. You want to co-host very deeply with another person. You want to be in a very healthy relationship with your groups, with nature or truth, and with creative spirit or God or whatever language is helpful for people. And so you don't have to pick one of those. You can begin once you have clarity about what is, as he would say, what is your big yes in life. Then you want to do that with your kids, with your coworkers. Your podcast is serving that. And so I think the problem is one of social organization. We are organized in such a way. I think it's extractive, as I've used that word. It's not regenerative. We are often organized in such a way that we are forced to make these choices, but there's other ways to organize. And I think that we have to begin to ask the question: well, who's getting rich off the current? Like, why should the pharmaceutical companies and their people who shareholders or whatever who benefit from that, why should they benefit from keeping people on maintenance meds forever? So I'm being a little bit, polemical, I guess, but we can begin to ask the question: what would it look like to organize for abundance rather than scarcity? Anytime you have a model that is encouraging of extraction and scarcity, then you're not going to be able to co-host across all five of those relationships. So I think what Jim's book does is, and he's been working with companies all over the world, high performing organizations, and he finds that high performing leaders co-host in all five relationships at the same time. It's not, trade-offs. It's about living the life of abundance and helping other people connect with that abundance. And that means we stop doing some of the extractive kinds of things. We stop organize. There's another book I'll recommend, Reinventing Organizations, that talks about the teal organization, the organization that is concerned with wholeness and not with um, compartmentalizing the world in order to dominate and ultimately extract.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the interesting things too about what happens when you do operate from that place of abundance and trying to facilitate abundance and this is just my anecdotal observation, but it seems like you're more willing to engage in pro-social behaviors like
Yeah,
giving and
right.
service and things that ultimately not only serve everyone else but deeply serve yourself too. So it's, I think there tends to be this kind of either or mentality of like either I'm looking out for myself or I'm looking out for everyone else. And there are these areas and there are these frameworks for thinking in which
Mhm.
those things complement each other and become extensions of each other.
Mhm. And I think it honors the fundamental reality of interconnectedness. We've created structures that dishonor that
Mm,
reality, and
yeah.
so they're unreal. And the idea of an externality is collective madness because really what we're saying when we talk about externalities is I'm not responsible for that. Someone else is going to pay that bill, and it's not going to be me. But ultimately, we all pay the bill, and
Yeah.
so we need to consider the kind of fundamental interconnectedness and work against processes that allow us to think that there's such a thing as an externality that doesn't come back to me in some way eventually. And it could just be sort of you know our own level of stress. We know it's wrong. We're participating in some process that's polluting the river downstream or something like that, and we convince ourselves that that doesn't matter, that's an externality, and we try to become happy by buying a big house or something, but
Mhm.
ultimately it's a pretty hollow thing. So finding ways to relate to ourselves and to others and to the wider world that honor interconnectedness is going to produce more flourishing, because we're not doing this mental gymnastics where our, as Kierkegaard would say, our um, there's despair lurking in our happiness. Like we're trying to cope with something that's fundamentally wrong, and we can do all sorts of mental gymnastics to do that, but ultimately in our heart we know it's wrong and we start to suffer. So I think it's better for us to be more intentional about why are we organizing and what is the goal. And if it's just to extract, then that era is over with. We've already these are the words of Otto Scharmer, who's written a lot of leadership books. We've already collectively created results that nobody wants. Now let's move to the next phase.
Well, and I think that gets at an important component as well. And I see this concept pop up kind of all over the place disguised in different language, but it's basically just the idea of ownership, and like you're saying, this idea of externality ignores the idea of ownership and taking ownership for what you do have ownership for, and that idea of owning. There was also featured a recent piece of research that came out of Harvard, I think Harvard Shine, about financial ownership and how much the way that you take ownership over your finances actually has a longer tail in terms of determining your financial wellness.
Right.
And so it seems to be that component of, conversations about justice and systems and things like that is equally as important.
Yeah, and I think what we have to overcome, among other things, is that we have rendered a lot of systemic harms invisible. And so we don't perceive them directly. We feel, unease. malaise or something. But we need to get clarity on this. We need to see this very clearly. And a lot of times there are processes where, we're trying to transform conflicts, we're trying to restore something, we're trying to get to the solution very quickly because we don't want to sit with the fullness of suffering, because we don't really want to see what that's going to reveal. And there's a need to dig deeper into the truth. And again, I see this as a spiritual practice. You if if other people are not infinitely valuable to you, then why would you do it? Like, what's the motivation? Well, I deserve this that somebody else doesn't, and that's just the way the world is. I didn't create the world. I'm not responsible for it. But you can begin to take ownership for it when you are present to the deeper truths, and you see how you benefit from this system that has rendered this suffering invisible. And then you can begin to get curious about, historically, why is that the case, and now what? What am I called to do? And again, I think a contemplative practice is necessary here, not just an individual practice, but being part of a community that has greater collective wisdom than any one individual, and can connect us with a story, some kind of redemptive narrative where we can locate our own individual lives in this broader narrative, so that we can see how we're contributing to something that can make a difference. And I think that does require a willingness to get closer to the truth, to dig deeper into those things that are invisible right now, but they can be made more visible. And again, I was using this idea of the externality as something that's borne by others. But we can start to get curious about how we've created all of these processes that are trying to externalize. But where's the garbage going to go? The plastic ends up in the ocean, and then the fish eat it, and then we eat the fish. So we are connected, and so let's start operating from that place of wholeness and honor that.
I love that you brought it to that place of getting curious about it too, because I've found personally curiosity to be the quickest pivot out of
Mm,
a lot of mentalities that, frankly, are not necessarily aimed at flourishing. But if you get threatened personally and you're feeling all the emotions that you're
mhm,
feeling, getting curious about it as opposed to putting your defenses up, or
mhm,
turning a blind eye, or turning all of the blame onto yourself and feeling existentially bad about it.
mhm,
But just that curiosity has been, for me, the greatest personal tool for how to navigate the world now,
mhm,
when frankly there's a lot that's super confusing.
mhm,
It's hard to know how to show up. It's hard to know what the right thing to do is. It's hard to know who to listen to, who not to listen to, who to trust, yada yada.
mhm.
But staying curious, I found, keeps me
Yeah, yeah.
open to these things that could potentially provide an answer or a way forward.
Right. No, I think that's so important. And, even something like physical suffering, one good bit of advice is to get curious about your own physical suffering, because otherwise we try to push it away, or we turn it into something that's more solid than it really is. And so if we get curious about it, we have a lighter touch with it. And,
Hmm.
sometimes people say, well, how can you talk about getting curious when there's all this suffering in the world? And I just say, because if I want to skillfully do something about it, I can't be in despair all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying let's get curious because it's so fascinating and all these people are suffering and the world's burning and all this stuff. I'm just saying, let's go in with an open mind, an open heart, and an open will. And again, this is sort of Otto Scharmer's approach to presencing. Let's sense what is, and then let's be open to what might be born here. And that's a kind of curiosity that allows us to stay energized and engaged, and maybe not as amygdala hijacked. I don't know if that's language I can
Sure.
use
Yeah.
broadly, but
Yeah.
let's not close off the creative parts of our mind because we're so emotionally charged that we just can't um, imagine a path forward. And so that's what I mean about curiosity. It's not um, to make light of the suffering. If you've got some debilitating physical condition, um, it's healthy advice to get curious about the pain involved there, because then you can see how it changes and what causes it to change, as opposed to turning it into this intractable thing that's just always present. So I think it's in the spirit of love and compassion that we get curious, and that is appealing. The leaders that I find appealing are the ones who can invite us to get curious about the most painful aspects of ourselves and our societies and our current context in a way that unlocks creativity and the possibility of change.
And it seems to me too that the adding and introducing the spiritual dimension to the conversation actually can provide you a dimension that helps you hold it when these things are very, very painful often and too painful sometimes. And so, yeah, being able to speak in terms of you've mentioned throughout this conversation a number of things being, in your view, a spiritual practice, but it is these all these things kind of swirl around each other and support each other and being able to hold the reality that we live now. And particularly, I would say even over the past year and a half now since we've entered into the pandemic. But yeah, I really appreciate that framework of thinking of spirituality in terms of support of all of these things.
How do we approach the depth of life that is there when we are oriented towards the surface, oftentimes
Mm.
by our culture? And so I think spirituality digs deeper. Um, and that is, in some ways, supported by the culture, and in other ways not. And so we sometimes get confused about the word love. We get confused about spirituality as well. So these are words that I think express something that's fundamentally inexpressible with
Yeah.
language, but it's pointing to something, and it's important for us to look where it's pointing.
Well, and at the risk of kind of ending on a really nerdy note, but I kind of want to get into a little bit of the sausage making with you as a researcher because, it's easy to have these deep conversations about these deep philosophies and that's something that the humanities offers, but I know that the Human Flourishing program also introduces rigor. And I want you to explain what that looks like in a social science context, because I think a lot of people who maybe haven't studied social
Yeah,
sciences or aren't active don't know exactly how the social sciences can be rigorous.
right. Yes. So just one brief example, we can think about our research on volunteering. People would say, okay, I can understand, a volunteer is going to have that warm feeling, the helper's high or the giver's glow or whatever. Big deal. What difference does that make? But through longitudinal research with lots of control variables, so we're trying to hold constant other factors, we can see that volunteers at a certain dose, and I think the recommended dose is about 100 hours a year, um, that if you engage in volunteering about two hours a week, 100 hours a year, that your heart is more likely to be beating in a few years than if you don't. And so I say yes, the giver's glow plays a role in that. And so let's not discount positive feelings that accrue to volunteers, but let's acknowledge that we can be more objective about it. We can ask the question, is this person's heart still beating? And we can look at a range of outcomes. And our program director Tyler Vanderweel has developed some statistical methodology that allows us to get a little bit closer to causal inference. So it's always dangerous to draw causal inference from surveys, for example. But through some of the methods that he's pioneered, and the fact that we have very large data sets with the ability to control for baseline outcomes, baseline levels of outcomes, and a bunch of control variables, we can say, well, it's still dangerous to make causal arguments, but we feel pretty confident that there's something here. There's something really powerful to look at, and if you do this research, very well, it actually can help shape policy because it's convincing. And that's a big part of why we do this, because it's valuable for us as individuals, but it can actually change the course of a society once you start to see, in this survey with 50,000 people with all of these rigorous controls, that some practice like volunteering can have all of these benefits. Then why wouldn't we want to engage in social prescribing, which other countries do much better? I think the UK is ahead of us on this one, rather than just prescribing maintenance meds. In some cases, um, overcoming the loneliness and feeling a greater sense of purpose by helping others is the medicine. And that will enable you to stay off blood pressure medicine or other things, perhaps, a few more years. And so why not, try that if the data are supportive? And, we're in some of this research is in its infancy, so I don't want to make too much of it, but why not study something more than just income or absence of disease? Why not study full flourishing and look at what practices and what social determinants affect that?
And I think it's something so exciting about the time in which we're living is that you have these two aspects. You have the data, the objective data that is being amassed at a scale we've never seen in human history. And so the social sciences, having access to that kind of objective data and then blending that, as you said at the beginning of the conversation, with a subjective lens of allowing people to self-report based on their own definitions
Mhm.
of what it is to be well, because we all have different values, we all have different things that we're seeking out of life. Happiness may be more important to one person, whereas meaning might be more important to another person. And so being able to marry those two, I find really special, and really a product of the technologies of our time.
Mhm. Yeah, and you can have a relatively high income, but if you're in a high cost of living area, you might worry about your ability to pay your bills. So we ask about, are you worried about, your safety? Are you worried about your ability to pay your bills? And I think that goes back to that notion of stress. Some people have found ways to cope with stress so that they're not worrying as much, and they are flourishing with less.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of cross cultural research that can shed more light on this. So we're hoping to embark on a global flourishing study later this year that might explore this in 22 countries, and that will offer us a lot of um, rich information to to get it. What difference does culture make in terms of how people understand their lives and evaluate whether they are doing and being well across all of these domains.
Yeah. Matt, I could speak to you for the next 4 hours, but I wanna end with a another simple but deep end question, which is, why do you do what you do, and what gives you hope about the work that you do?
And this another way to it's a great question. Another way to ask it is, what is flourishing for?
Yeah. What's it all for, man?
And so I think that if we are flourishing ourselves and we're able to help others flourish, that's a great sense of purpose in life. That really allows us to feel as though we're not just wasting our time, that the thing that we're doing is worthwhile. So I've been involved in lots of things over my life. I was a criminologist at one point, and it was all useful, but I think I'm really energized about helping individuals and groups find ways to flourish, because the payoff there is just so great. You can see the the shift from an extractive world to a more regenerative world, and that's good for everybody. And so it kind of goes back to Maslow, saying, well, it's nice to be self-actualized. That's where a lot of people get focused. I want to be self-actualized. But later in life, he died younger um, than he might have developed this further had he lived longer. But
Mhm.
towards the end of his life, his writings reflected self-transcendence. And
Mhm.
so it's not the ideal is not the what he called the merely healthy self-actualizer. The ideal is the person who's genuinely able to make a contribution um, to the wider world, and they do it in a healthy way. That they're not neglecting their kids and their own well-being. And so, how do we find balance and harmony in the midst of doing this work? That's a really fun puzzle.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back ultimately, to really deep understandings of love, and that's why we were created. So it's easy.
What a beautiful answer. And I know I'm assuming you're maybe familiar with the book Transcend that came out by Scott Barry Kaufman. I know he took a stab at really going in depth about Maslow's work. So anyone who's interested, I recommend that book. Are there any other books as well that you would like to recommend here at the very end?
It's always good to go back and read Viktor Frankl, Man's
Hmm.
Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. And I just did an event with the author of The Power of Meaning, Emily Esfahani Smith. And I used that book years ago in an undergraduate class. So it was great to be part of a webinar conversation with her. And she talks about connecting with the four pillars of meaning. And I'll leave it to readers to go find those pillars of meaning. But if you start to do all four of those things, um, your ability to be happy goes up, but your ability to contribute to the well-being of others goes up, and all of that's mutually reinforcing. So, yeah, I think those two books on meaning would be really helpful.
Great. Well, I will link those books as well as the other resources that you've mentioned in this episode in the episodes page on the website.
Wonderful.
And also, you threw this out just peppering that you were a criminologist, and I'm going to direct people to the Take a Seat podcast with Dr. Nick Holton, where you actually went in depth with that because I think it's a fascinating story that we couldn't cover here. But I'm going to recommend that listeners listen to that too because I think it's a really interesting framework that has shaped your work. So,
Oh, great.
Matt Lee, thank you so much. This was an absolute delight. I hope you'll come on again.
Thank you, Danielle. I enjoyed it very much. Look forward to reconnecting.